Welcome to another episode of the Dan Norton Show. Today, I am here with Bach Ho, a friend whom I've known for many years. Bach has a serious interest in Ayn Rand, and he earned a Ph.D. in philosophy. His dissertation was titled A Defense of Egoism. Today, we'll be discussing that and maybe another project that he has recently been working on his YouTube channel, which I will link in the description. Bach, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you.
Very
All
good.
right.
Very good.
Yes, indeed. It's not often that I've had another philosopher to discuss philosophy with, and also another objectivist philosopher, or at least someone who is very knowledgeable about objectivism.
Oh, I'm an
So this,
objectivist. And
yeah,
good to be a safe zone to objectivists.
sounds good. All right, so let's get into your Defense of Egoism. So you wrote a now I've talked a lot on my channel about egoism when I first began it about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now. I had something which I called the Selfishness Project, and I went around interviewing people and having discussions about selfishness. So it's egoism or selfishness. It's a topic I've given a lot of thought to, but you've written an entire dissertation about it. So I'm interested to pick your brain a bit and see what you have to say about it. So, as many viewers of my channel might know, Ayn Rand advocated egoism, the view that you should live for yourself. And she defended that across many of her writings, both fiction and nonfiction. In the nonfiction, I particularly think of her article, The Objectivist Ethics, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, which I don't know if it might show up blurry there. Maybe if I show it in the right spot.
Yeah, it's clear.
Um, so I want to hear what you have to say about a defense of egoism. I guess in academia, this is not a very popular viewpoint, but you defended it. So yeah, let's talk about your dissertation. I'm just going to turn the floor over to you, and you can get into it however you'd like.
I presented a two-part defense of egoism. The second part was a defense by appeal to intuitions, which are considered moral judgments about particular cases. Some might call it objective, some objectivists might call it an argument by appeal to emotion, and they would criticize it as invalid. That's a big discussion there. But the second part was trying to lay out ideas and situations to get people to be persuaded of self-interest in that case and build from there, and then anticipate objections and then address those objections and build a critical mass of intuitive support for selfishness. That was the second part, the part that's usually more interesting to people. The first part dealt with the nature of life and species and normativity in nature. An overall assumption of the first part is that there's normativity in nature, or we're running with the idea that there's normativity or good and bad, right and wrong in animate nature, living things, and we're trying to understand that as a possible groundwork for understanding normativity in human living things. And in that first part, I took as a launching point literature in the tradition of Aristotle, specifically Neo-Aristotelian writings. And a central idea of the Neo-Aristotelian writings is that the purpose of a living thing is to live as a member of its species, that every living thing has a species, and species have norms attached to them. Rabbits have 4 legs, rabbits eat grass, etc., etc. Horses have their norms, ferns have their norms, oak trees have their norms, and the purpose of a living thing is to adhere to the species norms. That's a view that certain interpretations of objectivist ethics align with. I criticize that view, arguing that species norms are abstractions that result from prior identifications of benefit and harm to living things. and that the purpose of a living thing is to live as itself, not per se as a member of its species. One quick argument to that effect is to offer examples in which, hypothetical or realistic, in which a living thing violates its species norms. What if you had a rabbit with wings, and the wings help the rabbit, escape predators? It violates species norms, but it's still good for the rabbit. So it can't be that per se adhering to species norms is normative. And I argue that moves like, well, then we have a new species, or we just have to adjust the species norms, they're not relevant because they're after the fact. The point is we can identify in individuals what is good or bad, and the species norms are just abstractions over that. They have an epistemological role as guidance, but per se, the purpose of a living thing is to live as an individual living thing. Species norms being epistemic guides, but not the per se grounding norm. I also, in that first part, offered an interpretation of something Ayn Rand said, I believe in the Objectivist Ethics, and maybe in Atlas Shrugged, in Gull Speech. She said that there's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it applies to only one class of things, living things. I thought a lot about that, and I flirted with, I'm not sure if flirt is the right word, but I forgot if I said I fully agree or I endorse my interpretation, but the idea I came to was, is she suggesting that a living thing, a chunk of matter that is a living thing, metaphysically is a living thing, and its existence is metaphysical in that if it ceases to be a living thing, that chunk of, either you kill that rabbit or fern or human being, then that chunk of matter is no longer a living thing, and that's metaphysical, independent of the mind. That's the interpretation I offered, and that I independently find somewhat attractive. By contrast, I suggested, so I think that I was interpreting that claim. I think that's an important sentence of hers. I don't know if she would agree. I don't know if other objectivists would agree. I've had some fights with objectivist intellectuals, at ARI about all my ideas, but and that species concepts, that thing is a horse, that thing is a pig, that thing is a fern, and I'm using species loosely here as kind. I'm not referring to exact taxonomy, biological taxonomy in the academy. That a chunk of matter that is a living thing metaphysically, but may not metaphysically be a horse or a pig or a fern, because those species concepts are epistemological. Yes, we also have the concept life, but I'm interpreting Rand, and flirting with agreement, as saying that life is special, living thing is special, because the chunk of matter itself is a living thing, even if there were no human beings or minds around to have the concept of living thing, whereas that chunk of matter would not be a horse or a pig or a fern if there were no human beings around or minds around to have concepts to justifiably derive concepts of horse, fern, living pig, etc. So if that idea is plausible, that idea that a living thing is metaphysical, that lends more credence to the idea I've been offering, that the purpose of a living thing is to live as an individual living thing, not per se as a member of its species, even though species norms have an important role epistemologically. I'll pause there.
Okay. Thanks for that intro to your dissertation. That was very rich and dense. Those are some words that came to mind. I guess compared to most of my discussions, this is a very intensive one. So I'm struggling to keep up, and it's a challenge. But I know when you're writing a dissertation, you've got all these nuanced distinctions, and they're automatized, and people who don't have a lot of your context, it can be challenging to keep up with it all. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
probably need to go over some of this maybe
No, and
multiple
no pressure.
times.
My intention was just you said, Bach, share about your dissertation. So I said two parts. One is the intuitive part, the emotional part that most people find more interesting and accessible. And then the other part is this dense biology part.
Yeah, and I think it might be good to talk about each of those. but maybe just to let people catch their breath or let me catch
Oh,
my breath a little.
yeah, no, sorry, no pressure. We can chill and I don't if I mean it's whatever, right? I mean you get what you get and people can rewatch if they find it interesting. I get it, but I get it. I mean I just want to lay out
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
concise and yeah,
we don't have a super strict format here,
yeah,
but I thought let's just do something very simple right now, and we'll get back into your dissertation in a
sure.
minute. But could you just tell us a bit about your backgrounds, maybe including like when you first read Ayn Rand and what drew you to this topic of egoism in the first place?
Yes, I discovered Ayn Rand when I was a teenager, 14 or 15 years old. A friend recommended uh, Atlas Shrugged and The Virtue of Selfishness. I read both, got into it, read a bunch of other stuff, read OPAR, Objectivism, Philosophy of Ayn Rand, got really interested in philosophy, was always interested, prior to discovering Rand, I was interested in big questions. Is there a God? What's the nature of the universe? What is this all about? Big fundamental philosophical questions. Um, I became an objectivist when I was a teenager. Loved philosophy, loved thinking about philosophy. Um, Pursued computer science in my undergraduate because I thought that's practical. Didn't have a sense that you could pursue philosophy. And then I ran the Ayn Rand Campus Club, and then studied at the Ayn Rand Institute. And then after becoming a computer programmer for a while, the interest in philosophy was still there and very strong. So I decided, let's do the PhD, got a master's in philosophy, got a PhD in philosophy. Um, Decided to come out as an objectivist uh, in the master's program and the PhD program. And bad consequences came to me from coming out as an objectivist, but I had to because I just can't. I have to come out of the closet. So did the dissertation, A Defense of Egoism. Um,
And where did you do your if you don't mind saying your
oh,
graduate work? I don't know if
uh,
you mentioned that.
Undergraduate UC Irvine, master's Arizona State University, PhD was at UC Riverside.
Okay.
Um, then I taught philosophy at Cal State Fullerton for 10 years, taught ethics and critical thinking and philosophy and many different ethics courses. Meanwhile, working on the defense of egoism. The closest I got, as you know this, the journal philosophy, top tier journal in academic philosophy, got to revise and resubmit off of my paper on egoism, but ultimately rejected. Then I also studied, kept up with the Ayn Rand Institute, took courses there, networked with the objectivist intellectuals, tried to convince various objectivist intellectuals of my views. Not much success there yet. I forgot your original question. Tell us about your background. Oh, background. And then when I was a teenager, there was an interest in philosophy and psychology, and especially value-oriented questions about how to live. So at one point, I wanted to go into psychology, maybe become a psychologist, but philosophy took over because it's my first passion. Objectivism is my first passion. But throughout the whole career, I was in therapy for various things and benefited a lot and kept thinking about psychology and then discovered a certain modality in the healing world called organic intelligence, which I'm very interested in. So now that's my second value, and I'm pursuing that as a path. The YouTube channel that I just started is about just exploring organic intelligence and objectivism and philosophy broadly construed. So right now, it's my top passion is still objectivism, and the second passion is now organic intelligence. Still very much interested in philosophy, but now devoting the current time to thinking about organic intelligence, laying out the ideas. Um, okay, yeah,
Okay. I like that. It's I think it gives us a good overall picture of your background and your interests. So and that was much easier for me to follow. So
yeah.
th
And my intention was not, pro overload. It was just
oh no, no.
the dissertation is dense, so
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. Okay. So let's then try to get back into the dissertation some and what we might need a second, third pass over some of this to really digest
yeah,
the what you're saying. So you said the second part might be an easier way into it, or maybe people are more interested. So I'm thinking maybe it would be good to start discussing some of that a bit. Could you tell us some about you called it an intuitive type of defense? Just what does that involve? Can you give us
Yeah.
some examples?
So
Yeah.
there's a in philosophy there's this phrase reflective equilibrium, and it refers to a process of reflecting on your considered judgments in particular cases. Should you be selfish here? Should you be selfish here? Should you do this or that in this case, that case? And then on your principles and trying to find coherence. Now,
This is reminding me of like the trolley cases, like you're
yeah, but I
presented with this.
yes, but I'm trying to deal with like real life, real life living
Okay.
cases,
Okay.
and from an objectivist perspective, there's going to be a lot of criticism of reflective equilibrium. But working within the academy, working with the tools that are there, just doing my thing, it was let me try to do reflective equilibrium and try to defend egoism. One fundamental idea, one fundamental assumption I had was, or thought I had was, this cannot be an all or nothing enterprise. So most people will say, well, you shouldn't always be selfish, but you shouldn't always be selfless. So you got to find the healthy balance. And what is that? 90% selfish, 10%? Is it 50-50? But I thought, okay, but that's all still empty unless you have examples. So let's just go with, I'm here offering a line of reasoning based on particular cases that will try to convince you of more selfishness. And I just begin with, here's a case. You want to pursue your career, but your parents want you to sacrifice your career for something else. Most people would say you should be selfish in that case. Okay, there's an anchor for me. A lot of people say, well, that doesn't show egoism because here are 1,000 cases in which you shouldn't be selfish. Got that. But we're not doing all or nothing, and we're not doing deductive. We're doing inductive, reflective equilibrium, and you're just trying to see how I reason towards the critical mass of intuitions in favor of selfishness. So I talk about in this particular case in which you pursue your career instead of sacrificing it, some people may say, well, what's admirable is the virtues you exhibit in developing a career. And I criticize that by saying, yes, but specifically what's admirable is that the virtues are geared towards your happiness. If you employ those virtues to sacrifice your happiness for your parents, then that's morally unattractive. So I try to really ground the attraction of virtue in its service to long-term well-being. Then I take two common principles in that are commonly accepted in common sense morality. According to common sense morality, two principles are help others and don't harm them. And then I think, how far can I get by taking those two principles at face value, help others and don't harm them? And how do they align with the principle of self-interest? So I come up with different cases to argue that for many of us, our considered judgments are help others when it fits into your long-term pursuit of happiness, and don't help others when it grates against your long-term pursuit of happiness. I do the same thing with the non-malevolence principle. There's a do no harm principle. And I say, well, you have to harm people sometimes. When you break up with someone, that causes massive harm to them. So how far can we get by trying to reflect on the principle of self-interest and get you to find it plausible? Harm people to the extent it promotes your long-term happiness, genuinely promotes your long-term happiness, and don't harm people to the extent it does not promote your long-term happiness. And through discussions of dozens and dozens of cases, I try to show that common sense morality, help others, don't harm them, if you look at your considered judgments about when and how those principles apply, they align quite closely with the pursuit of long-term self-interest. And now one other part is, well, what if you have residual um sorry, God, it's so complex. And if you have a principle that seems to capture like 90-95% of these cases, that's strong reason to think there's a principle grounding here. It's not just I unquestionably accept my intuitions, and if the principles don't fit, then I just keep the intuitions in particular cases and throw away the principles. So all that is to say, it's a get into the mud, get into the mess, and think through and see how people would object and see what emotional reactions people would have, and see what you can do to defend selfishness, not through deductive trickery, but through here are my ideas, here's the onslaught of objections coming from different directions, and I'm just going to try to find my way through trying to show you how self-interest integrates a lot of what you find plausible and then ditch the rest.
Okay, interesting. I'm curious about the reception. Like when you've done this, presenting it either in seminars or your dissertation, and maybe getting feedback from people on your committee. Um, can you tell us something about how people have received this? Have they thought, oh yeah, I guess it is good to be egoistic. That does seem kind of plausible, or at least more plausible now that I've considered this process of reflective equilibrium than prior to having considered it.
Yeah.
Can you say something on that?
Students who have seen the reflective equilibrium defense find it very plausible. This makes a lot of sense. You're not trying to do anything tricky. There's nothing sly here. You're just thinking through life and seeing how plausible the principle of self-interest is. So they find it very plausible, very refreshing. Academics, the biologists on my committee found it very interesting. The rest probably didn't. I mean, they're so deep in their ways, and I mean, they're not going to not easily influence academics. Well, the two reviewers who considered my reflective equilibrium defense for the journal of philosophy found it plausible. So one reviewer said it was very refreshing to see this spirited approach. Like, and he or she had objections, but they said the objections don't sink your project. I mean, ultimately the paper was rejected from the journal, but so I think any honest, reasonable person would find it, okay, this is a serious line of thought and doesn't and deserves to be considered seriously. I mean, the people who hate Ayn Rand, the people who hate egoism, they're just not going to listen. Many philosophers won't listen because they're too deep-seated in their ways. But I would say among just reasonable, honest people, they find it very attractive and they understand.
Okay. And I think you described this as an inductive kind of approach, which I think was Ayn Rand's approach, which is very different than the deductive sort of approach that you might find in academic philosophy a lot of the time. Just very grounded in concrete cases, examples, not just dealing with abstractions and principles apart from concrete cases. Uh, okay, so that's the intuitive approach. And then is there more to say about that? Or is this a good time, do you think, to talk
I
some about the first part? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm of two minds. I could say one point about it, but it may be too specialized and geared towards objectivists, not a wider audience. Let's move on.
Well, my audience, I don't know exactly its composition, but I would guess there's a
Okay,
mix
let me just,
of,
okay, I'll decide. Let's do it. So
okay.
I did mention the word inductive, and you reflected that I mentioned that word. And then the question is the reflective, how does the reflective equilibrium defense relate to what induction is in ethical theory, what objectivists would regard as legitimate induction in ethical theory? Large topic, 1 point on it. In the objectivist corpus, when approaching induction of moral principles, or at least of egoism, I think of all moral principles and egoism, life as a center of value, the induction has the form of identifying behavior that hurts you, identifying behavior that harms you, and seeing integrations across those behaviors and grounding the results in the living process. That was very abstract.
Just
I'm not even,
just one thing before we go on, for anyone who's not familiar with these terms, induction or deduction. Induction is where you're starting with particular observations, like eh, this dog has a tail, this other dog has a tail, and then this third dog has a tail. Now I'm going to generalize all dogs have tails. So when you start from particulars and then you generalize and make some abstract conclusion, that's a process of induction. And then it's the reverse. With deduction, you start with a general principle, like all dogs have tails, and then you hear, oh, Fido is a dog. Well, then Fido must have a tail. So you start with the general conclusion, the abstract conclusion, and then you apply it to a particular case. That's the deductive mode. And there might be more nuanced things to say about these, but just to give you a general broad strokes idea, in case you're not familiar with these terms, that's what it means. So Bach is talking about an inductive sort of approach to ethics, which Ayn Rand took, where you start with particular observations and then reach some general principles or abstractions. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Go.
no, I appreciate that. And now, with that, I had more, my biology had more time to process stuff. So, um, the one point I want to make is that in the objectivist inductive approach to ethics, objectivism denies that emotions are tools of cognition. They can give you hints, but they're not tools of cognition. And so emotional reactions per se are not cognitively valid. I'd have to think more about what I just said, but since we're on video and being just in real time, um, the objectivist the objectivist inductive approach to ethics would not regard emotions as valid tools of cognition. Now, in my method of reflective equilibrium, I'm just opening the door to other people's emotional reactions to certain cases, my emotional reactions to certain cases, not saying the emotional reaction grounds right or wrong, but just acknowledging that that's part of the intuitive process. So in a sense, my reflective equilibrium process is a lot messier and a lot more chaotic because I'm not like there's a point I'm circling around and I want to emotions matter, your feelings matter. To do philosophy, to do ethics, while asking people to withhold their emotional reactions to certain cases misses out on a lot of productive data that may be relevant to considered moral judgment. So my reflective equilibrium process is not would not be like official objectivist inductive approach to ethics. There's a lot more to think through there, but I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, exactly what an inductive approach looks like is it seems like it could be a big question unto itself. Like,
Yeah.
for example, what exactly are the role of emotions and introspection in an inductive process? Should it be exclusively an extrospective process where you're just looking out, or you also have to look in? I would think that in something like ethics, it's going to involve both introspection and extrospection. Which is one other point I thought of about the superiority of an inductive approach. Um, you can't. The only way to get general principles is from concretes. So we're not Platonists. Well, if you're an objectivist, you reject this idea that we're born with innate ideas, abstractions divorced from experience. uh, Ayn Rand has a more Aristotelian view where abstractions come from, they're grounded in your perception of reality. So if you're not a rationalist, that's a term, technical term in the history of philosophy, which I think involves, among other things, a belief in innate ideas. I think at least many rationalists do. Like you're born with innate content. If you reject that, if you're an empiricist, and you think that knowledge has to be grounded in sensory observation, which Ayn Rand does, then you're going to need to take an inductive approach. There's nowhere else for abstract principles to come from, but from observations, sensory observations, ultimately, of concrete things in reality. So I think it is a epistemologically superior approach, an inductive approach. Um, any deduction is only as strong as the weakest induction underlying it, because deductive principles have to come from induction. So this is just kind of fleshing out some of the epistemology of this discussion. But then also another epistemological aspect which you've raised is emotions. So what role, if any, do emotions have in cognition? Do they tell us something? If so, exactly what? So Ayn Rand has a whole theory of emotions, of what they are. So I think they could be described as automatized value judgments. So, for example, a baby might see a snake and have no reaction at all to it, positive or negative. It's just it's a blank. But over time, it learns that snakes are dangerous. They can do harm and cause pain. And then later, as you know, once it becomes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and it sees the snake, it has an immediate reaction, because it's gained knowledge in the intermediate years about this object. So it's no longer just having a blank reaction when it sees it. It has an automatized reaction. Um, and we're not always aware of the intervening judgments between the perception of the snake and the emotional reaction to the snake. But there is an intervening judgment, namely snakes can be dangerous. And if you hadn't learned that, if the baby had never learned that in the intervening years, the snake might still be just cause it a blank reaction. So over time throughout life, we learn lots of things about the world and its impact on ourselves. And then in future uh, occasions, we have these automatic responses based on our knowledge and our evaluation. So if you're a sadist or if you're a masochist, you might know the snake can do danger, but now you have a unusual kind of evaluation of the snake. Maybe you like pain. So even though you know it can do harm to you, if you value the harm, the snake might bring about a positive reaction to it. So depending on your cognition and your evaluation of things in the world, you have a different immediate emotional response to it. And I think there's a very good discussion of the nature of emotions in Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. So anyone who wants to learn more about this sort of thing, you can check that out. So that was kind of a big detour. Just wanted to dig into some of these concepts that were coming up a bit. Um, so let me throw it back to you, though. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just that we are raising a lot of big questions and issues, too many to track in an organized way, and that's just how it is right now. So I think that'll be a big major theme here. And if you keep asking me questions about dissertation, more ideas will come out, and it's going to raise a lot of stuff. And that's just what we're doing, which is cool and fun.
Yeah, philosophy is a very broad subject and it's all integrated. So, one topic raises another and it's all a big web. It's all an integrated structure. Okay, so we've talked a while about the intuitive approach, and you mentioned that emotions are irrelevant when doing ethics, and that strikes me as plausible. I mean, if you think that happiness is a good thing, which I think it is, pleasure, also we could say, and Ayn Rand says the happiness is the purpose of morality or the purpose of life. Maybe she puts it in both ways in different passages. And happiness is a kind of emotion. I think she describes it as the emotion which proceeds from the achievement of your values. She describes it elsewhere as non-contradictory joy. So I think it is very relevant to consider, what things bring this emotion about. If that's the point of it all, is to have this certain emotion, um, then it does seem like something relevant to pay attention to. Now, there is a question of,
Wait,
are we hedonists? Is it only an emotion? Exactly what is hedonism? Is
yeah,
it
can I
life
can I
that we're aiming
can
at, or is it happiness? There's some questions there, but you have something you want to say. Let me
yeah, I
throw it back to you.
if you had just said that I was saying that emotions are irrelevant to ethics, I don't think I said that, but I don't know. But let me just say, let's not have me on record as saying that. I'm not prepared to say that. One
I
thing
thought you were saying they are relevant,
relevant, not irrelevant.
right? You were
Oh,
saying it's
okay. Sorry,
it's relevant.
I thought you said irrelevant. Yeah, the material point. I may be on a different track than you were just on, and this is just the nature of philosophy, not philosophy per se, but just how we're doing this discussion. Um, a major question here is the relationship between your emotional reaction and um, the 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 veracity of a moral judgment. So, for example, you see a rich person walking by a homeless person who's asking for money, and the rich person ignores the homeless person, and you have the emotional reaction, how horrible I hate the rich person. I feel sympathy for the homeless person. The rich guy should give money to the homeless person. The fact that he's not giving, the fact that I'm disgusted and angry at the guy for not giving money to the homeless person means that he's doing something wrong, which means that it's morally good if the rich person gives money to the homeless person. The question is the role of emotional reaction in moral inquiry. And I think, I mean, both of us would say, well, you can't just infer from your hatred of the rich guy and your sympathy for the homeless person that he did something wrong. But at the same time, we are acknowledging that what exactly is the role of emotion in ethical inquiry is a large topic, even if you can't just directly infer from an emotional reaction to a moral verdict.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering, like, what more we can say about the role of emotion in ethical inquiry. So, is there is there like a prima facie plausibility to saying, well, if something causes you to have a positive emotion, that's at least some evidence that it might be good. Maybe it's not, conclusive, but is that at least some evidence that it's good that you have this, positive emotional response to it? And if you had no positive emotional response to something or a negative response, would that be at least some evidence that it's not good? Um,
No, I mean,
uh,
not no, because that's just, but you have very familiar objections there, which is, well, our emotional reactions are a product of the ideas we accept. Do you believe in God or not? What does God say? If God says being gay is wrong and you were taught that and you believe and you have certain emotions. So there are very familiar objections to that. What I would say here is that your immediate emotional reactions to something are a starting point for inquiry, even if the emotions cannot be taken as evidence in favor of any moral verdict. And part of my wanting to take emotions as relevant to inquiry is that I think a major project in ethics for a defender of egoism is to just be messy with people. And they'll say this, they'll have their reactions, you'll have your reactions, and then just to get into it. And that's like an underlying impetus for reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium is the process of adjudicating intuitions. What is an intuition? Well, that can involve your thought, but which involves your emotions. And are you just being knee-jerk reacting? Are you reacting from a knee-jerk place? Or are you being reflective? But even if you're being reflective, it may still be a knee-jerk reaction. You're just not so aware of it. So we're this is very complex terrain. The upshot is I'm trying in the second part, I'm trying to defend egoism in a way that is maximally vulnerable to objections from every direction and trying to embrace them and work through them.
mhm.
That's the formulation of the moment. I don't know how much I stand by it if I reflect on it later, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
John Rawls keeps popping to mind because I know he's strongly associated with this
I
method.
believe he introduced that term, I believe, and the method, or at least codified it in a way that was canonical, and then other people took from it. Yes.
Okay. I, can you say a bit about how he uses it, if you're familiar with him at all?
Very little, I can say very little. I mean, we know, theory of theory of justice, but, and, maximize the well-being of but that's his political stuff. Um, that it may be that there's a coherentist influence underlying, it's a coherentist position, which is we're not trying to get out of reality. We're just trying to massage, is that too derogatory? I don't know, too slippery, too vague, but we're just trying to adjudicate our judgments in particular cases and our principles to form a cohesive whole, and that increases the reliability of our beliefs.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I've only read the first chapter of A Theory of Justice, and it's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly how he uses it. But I just know that this method is often associated with him. Okay. But getting back to to a defense of egoism. So,
Can I make one more quick point?
yeah, yeah, sure.
I think one motivation of the second part was to be able to dialogue with someone about egoism wherever they're coming from, in whatever context they have, rather than requiring them to set aside all their pre-existing beliefs and then go over here and look at this different argument, starting with the distinction between living things and non-living things, and living things to have to do things to sustain themselves, and that's the root of value, and then the standard of value is life, and that's egoism. Yes, I mean, that is the, I suppose, objective, proper, inductive derivation of egoism. But to ask someone to set aside their current context and then just go with this abstract argument, I don't think that is, what's the point of that if they're not going to be convinced? And then the more they have to bracket all their current emotional reactions and thoughts and questions and objections, the more
Mm.
they may be suspicious, at least the biologists will be suspicious of this abstract argument coming from the side. So is there a way to just allow them to fully discharge whatever messiness they have and then work with that and then and show where you're coming from and why? That's a major impetus for me,
Mm.
which
Okay.
magnifies the complexity and the messiness quite a bit. And philosophers who are attracted to rationalism and deduction and want to avoid messiness and emotion and anything that would cause them discomfort would not be so into that kind of project.
Mhm. This phrase "meet them where they are" is coming to mind.
Yeah.
It seems like that's what you're doing. You're not trying to yank them over to some alien context. You just meeting them in the context that they're already in, and then just
Hmm.
tweaking things a bit. Um,
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I,
And more quickly finding out whether there's any point in discussion or a point in talking to them. I mean, if their position is Ayn Rand sucks, if their position is selfishness is obviously wrong, if their position is Allah says this and that's it, okay, then we're done. We just, you go back to wherever you were, I'll go to McDonald's.
okay.
Even though my interest is not polemics or social engagement, but it was the impetus in that second part of the dissertation.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Um, I guess there could be advantages and disadvantages to that sort of approach of meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
Oh, get an alarm here. All right. Shall we say something about the first part or dig into that a little bit more? This was the life species normativity stuff.
Yeah, I have, I think that I yes, that was really dense. Here's, I think, something just a little more just easy, accessible. I have some disagreements with other objectivist intellectuals. Um, no personal issue, but just intellectual disagreement. So when I was fighting for my views and defending my views in certain seminars with them, one had the view, to recalibrate. In one of the books that maybe Alan Gottolf and Greg Salmieri published, Ayn Rand Companion to this or that, there's some essay and there's some footnote that suggested, if by memory, if I'm wrong on my memory, but that maybe a beehive could be a living thing or some aggregation of living things, depending on the species, could be a living thing. That I think I would say is dead wrong, and I would oppose that. So you see that there's actual disagreement here. And then this other objectivist intellectual suggested that when a salmon lays eggs and dies, that the death of that salmon was a benefit to the salmon because it is part of the species norms of the salmon that they lay their eggs and die. My position is false, bullshit, 100% wrong. And your view and the beehive thing may be emanating from this view that the species norms are per se normative and metaphysically grounding, and that the purpose of a living thing is to adhere to its species norms. If that is your conclusion, then that makes your view much more dramatically different, sharply different from mine, which is no, the individual survival is normative. The species norms can help us epistemically access survival. But if you get to the conclusion that it's good for a living thing, that it benefits an individual salmon to die because it's part of its species norms to do so, that's incorrect. And maybe Harry Binswanger had the view that, well, there's still a connection between life and benefit, because the salmon benefits its children, and so there's still some kind of connection between action and benefit, even though it's not benefit to that individual. I forgot now if I don't remember exactly what Dr. Binswanger said in this context, but if it's saying that somehow you can salvage the view that benefit to the living thing is what's normative, but somehow but you can, oh God, my brain is at max. Like there was something like, well, yes, the salmon dies, but its children benefit. So there's still a connection between that individual's action and benefit. Now, I would say, okay, but so what? The point is still a living thing is a chunk of matter, and what's normative is that chunk of matter, not other chunks of matter. So I think at one point it may have been the dissertation that the metaphysical worldview here is pudding with raisins. Every raisin being a living thing. Okay, Dan.
Pudding with raisins.
Pudding with raisins.
Okay, you might have to explain that some more. But I did have a
Yeah.
thought of what maybe you were trying to get at in this last segment, which is I think Harry has argued, Harry Binswanger, that if an organism does something that results in its own death, it's not necessarily a self-sacrificial kind of action. I mean, the very term sacrifice, I think it implies choice, which doesn't really apply to the non-human realm, at least on the objectivist view. I think choice is particular to human beings, not other species. So the whole issue of morality and making certain choices that promote your life or that destroy your life, which you could call egoistic or self-sacrificial, those terms aren't strictly applicable to the non-human realm. But uh, if something like a salmon does something that results in its own death, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was acting in a anti its own survival way. If you take a larger sort of maybe cross-generational view of it, because I think the idea was like it's taking this sort of action, but it only does that because its parents would have taken that action for it. And it wouldn't exist in the first place had it not been for the fact that that sort of behavior was encoded in its genes. So if you take this kind of intergenerational perspective, then I think that's where in action, which out of context might seem like it's to the detriment of the organism, might seem different.
I want to interrupt. May
Um,
I please interrupt?
yeah, go ahead.
I think that is something like Binswanger's view, which I'm against. And I Ryan, one point or argument, so it was a sustained argument in the dissertation, is that the chunk of matter that is a living thing is the source of normativity. What other living things currently exist? What other living things existed in the past? What other living things will exist in the future? And the entire history of anything you want to say regarding evolution or natural selection is totally irrelevant. the chunk of matter that is a living thing is the source of normativity, and it is the source of normativity for that living thing. And what's normative is to survive. The objectivists will come at me with saying, well, that's incoherent, Bach. It's survival as a member of a species. Otherwise, you can't talk about parts of the living thing. And uh, there's more to be thought about there. But for now, what I'm saying is the fact that you need concepts and species concepts to describe a living thing is just fine. I mean, that's true. But that doesn't alter the merits of the idea I'm proposing, that a chunk of matter that is a living thing is a living thing, and then think to Ayn Rand's claim that the one fundamental alternative is existence or non-existence that applies to living things, putting with raisins, and that if you smash a horse, you've killed a living thing metaphysically, or if a rock falls on a horse and the horse dies, a living thing has died. That's metaphysical. But whether that living thing is a horse is not metaphysical. That depends on our having concepts of horse. It's a lot. Back to the prior so one point I throw out there in the dissertation is that the whole talk of evolution and natural selection is irrelevant to the fact that a chunk of matter that is a living thing is a normative chunk of matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thought I'm having on this is there's a discussion in what's the article in The Virtue of Selfishness? The, the Ethics of Emergencies. I think that's the one where Ayn Rand discusses lifeboat cases and says that it could be egoistic to risk your life to save your husband, for example, or your wife, your spouse. So if you have a loved one who is drowning, it's not a sacrifice to risk your own life to save that person. At least not necessarily a sacrifice. It could be in your own interest because that person is such a value to you that you wouldn't want to live without that person. And I wonder if something similar could be said in the salmon case or non-human cases. Like if some parents, salmon parents, does risks or gives up its own life to save its salmon children, could it be argued that it's not sacrificing itself, it's doing an egoistic thing? Again, I'm using this term a little loosely because I don't think, strictly speaking, it's egoistic if there's
I
no
want to
choice
interrupt
involved.
when you allow. I want to interrupt. I know you're
Okay.
not interrupting, but I'm so excited that I want to interrupt. So just but
I'm about to let you interrupt.
okay,
Just
okay,
give me like
okay,
a few more
okay,
seconds.
okay.
So I wonder if it could be argued that when the salmon gives up its life for its salmon children, it actually is doing something in its own interest because it wouldn't, it's not a life worth living to live without its salmon children. It would be so miserable. So it's better for that salmon to die and to spare its children. So maybe there's a kind of egoistic argument there. Go ahead now.
First of all, thank you for raising that, for saying what you just said. Thank you for listening to what I'm saying and actually thinking about it. I appreciate that a lot. So, some people don't. Um, and you made me realize from what you said, I remembered other things I said in the dissertation, and I addressed that exact point. So, and I'll try to reconstruct this as quickly and smoothly as possible. So, in a word, no to all that. So, um, half facetious. So, one thing I do in the part of the dissertation in part one where I'm trying to argue that well-being is survival, not pleasure, happiness, or well-being is survival, and pleasure and happiness and desire are aspects of well-being. One thing I do there is ask the question, when does benefit actually occur? What, not in the future, but when does it actually occur? When and where is occurrent benefit? And the answer to that has to be benefit happens when there's a change in a living thing, in a chunk of matter that is a living thing. Harm happens when there's a change in a living thing, in a chunk of matter that's a living thing. That's when occurrent benefit and harm happen. Usually, we are not thinking about occurrent actual benefit and harm in that sense, because usually we're thinking, I gotta pay rent, I gotta get a better job or get a promotion, I gotta feed my kids, I gotta pay the mortgage, I gotta plan for vacation, I gotta go to therapy for my anxiety. We're thinking about future benefit, and occurrent benefit just happens in the organism, but we're not thinking about occurrent benefit. But if we're doing philosophy and really trying to think about the exact nature of things, about the exact nature of the world, the exact nature of normativity and living things, occurrent benefit, actual benefit, happens in the organism, in an effect in the organism, and harm is also an effect in the organism. When we're talking about I would rather die than let my wife be eaten by the crocodile, or I'd rather climb a mountain with a 25% chance of death than live without climbing that mountain, or I would rather live, take risk XYZ to my life rather than live without pleasure. We are talking about facts about our psychology and how we need to live and under what conditions we should be unwilling to live. Like, if you're in pain all the time, stage 4, this, that, and you want physician-assisted suicide, and then Objectivist says go for it because your life sucks, so why just be in pain for the next 3 months? All that, fine. I'm with all that. But as far as occurrent benefit and harm, technically you are harming yourself. Now, now it may be normatively good or morally good for you to do something that results in your death because of these facts about psychology and under what conditions we're willing, and facts about pleasure and desire and happiness and motivation. But that's a separate issue from what is occurrent benefit and harm. And occurrent benefit and harm is the exact understanding of harm you're talking about when you want to talk about the exact normativity and source of normativity. And the source of normativity is the raisins, the chunks of matter that are living things. So it is not of benefit to the salmon for it to die. Strictly speaking, it is not a benefit to jump into the crocodiles to save your life, even if you die. Benefit in the strict metaphysical metaphysical sense. At the same time, I'm for speaking in the attenuated sense of benefit. Yes, it's a benefit to you to risk your life to save your child, your wife, because that's what you want. She's a crucial value to your happiness, and you'd rather die than her die. Fine. So I think a distinction needs to be made there between, I don't have the words exactly, but the metaphysical normativity and normativity as understood, bringing in facts about how human beings have to pursue their long-term well-being, and facts about pleasure and desire and under what conditions we would be motivated to live. Some objectivists I know would criticize, saying, oh, Bach, you're using human, which means you're using species concepts, which means you admit that species are normative, not individuals. But again, the species norms are epistemic guides. The actual normativity is the living thing. And the quick way to see that is to imagine counterexamples of a living thing violating species norms in a way that benefits it. A rabbit with wings, a human being with wings. And the reply, but then it wouldn't be a human being, then it wouldn't be a rabbit. That's not relevant. That just means you're revising these other norms. I'm pointing out that what's normative is for the individual to survive as an individual, as the chunk of matter it is.
Hmm. Okay. A couple
Sorry if I spoke
thoughts.
too quickly. I mean, the excitement is kind of, so, yeah.
That's right. Well, people can watch it in zero point 0.5
Uh,
playback mode if it's going too fast. Uh, um, so one thought is that maybe you could say it's a net benefit, or like an all things considered benefits. Like you might acknowledge it's bad for the salmon to die, but maybe you would say it's not bad all things considered, or on
yeah, I don't
net
like
if
that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do ATC. I'm very suspicious. That's a very academic, takes the context of you're getting into, sorry, I know I'm interrupting you. All things considered is very epistemic. We're talking about a raisin. We're talking about a chunk of matter that's a living thing. If you squash it, it's no longer alive. If a salmon dies, the salmon dies. That's a chunk of matter that was animated becoming inanimate. All things considered comes in a context where human beings are thinking about, well, if I take a job in this location, there are benefits there, but cons. And if I take a job here, okay, but that's getting back into the living of life, thinking long term, bringing in facts about human psychology. But if you're just talking about the chunk of matter and occurrent actual benefit, that is a matter of what is happening in the living thing.
Okay. Um,
Sorry for
so
interrupting.
so can you judge what is good for a a chunk of matter? That's an interesting phrase, by the way, chunk of matter.
I, yeah,
Um,
it was really trying to,
it, it's such a it brings to mind like a chunk of meat, like a mindless kind of
what,
thing, but I don't think you
can I say
necessarily mean that.
what my intention, what I'm trying to drive at is, like, if you look around your surroundings, if I look at my surroundings, there are different objects like a water bottle, a cup, a keyboard, and then I'm an object, and then the window. I'm inviting the perspective of the universe as a plenum, except for raisins, and the raisins are living things. Everything else is a plenum. So imagine for a moment your water bottle, your pencil, your toothpaste, your phone, everything else is just melding. It's just a plenum. And what's left is individual living things. And that's just a visual way to get at my view of an interpretation of that statement of Ayn Rand of the one fundamental alternative is existence or non-existence, and it applies only to living things. So
Hmm.
yes, if you if you if you break my cup, the cup is destroyed, it no longer exists. But it exists now, and then you break the cup, then it doesn't exist, is a different form of existence, is a different contrast from a living thing existed, then you pulverize it. But by my interpretation, she's suggesting that living thing exists metaphysically as a living thing. The cup doesn't. It's there, of course, and we have a concept for it, and we rightly have a concept for it. It has properties it has. But the cup is a cup in virtue, in part of having a concept which is justified and objective. But a living thing, there's more to say. It's metaphysically a living thing. That's why I'm pushing, that's why I threw out offered the pudding with raisins.
Hmm. Okay. This is getting into another big discussion, like what is the nature of life? Like
Yeah.
setting
Well,
aside value terms at all, like good and bad. Just what is life? Is
okay.
it?
I will say two, sorry for interrupting you
And
again.
Ayn Rand has an answer. I mean, she
Two,
defines it, or at
yeah.
least
So
characterizes it as a
I will say
process of
this.
self-sustaining and self-generated action. But
Yes, that's her, and it's right, and which I'm inherited and used, and that's right. Two living things together are not a living thing. If you have two human beings, that's not a living thing. A society is not a living thing. A dead salmon is not a living thing.
by definition.
That sounds too obvious, but somehow I got there intellectually. Um, yeah.
So you want to say that I'm wondering if you're trying to say that or trying to say that something is good out of context, and if that's possible, like if you have this notion of an occurrence of benefits, like a benefit that is happening at a given time, irrespective of some run, longer range point of view. And
Okay.
I'm wondering, maybe you can do that. But I'm just wondering about that. Like you might think, when my nerves are stimulated in a certain way, I'm getting a massage, and it just feels good at that moment, regardless of what the long-term consequences of having that massage are. Like maybe for some reason, um, that massage will put me to sleep, and then it happens to be a homicidal maniac, and he's going to kill me. So we might say, well, in the long run, it's bad to um, get this massage, but at the moment, it feels good. And that remains true even if there are some negative long-term consequences that follow it. So maybe there's a legitimate notion that you're trying to get at by saying, there's all that matters ultimately is this occurrence kind of benefits.
No,
I don't know
no,
if you're saying something like
no, no,
that,
no,
but
no, 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 no. What matters is your life and your happiness, and what matters is get food on the table and find friends and find partners and figure out what you want from life and figure out your interests and go to Disneyland and enjoy life and read books you like and live life. That's what matters. That's what matters. So yes, go forth. Um, the reason the idea of occurrent benefit was coming up was I was trying to isolate. I'm trying to get people to really focus on what benefit is. Okay, I'm trying to resuscitate the motivation for this concept, but it was a way of getting people to my pudding with raisins view. So when exactly is when exactly do you benefit in the metaphysical sense? And I'm not talking about pleasure or desire fulfillment. I mean, pleasure's pleasure's beneficial, but there's a context underneath that, which is it sustains life. From the objectivist perspective, it's life that grounds normativity. Pleasure is an aspect of a living thing, just as gills, fangs, wings, or cells are. And pleasure helps us, pain can alert you to danger, pleasure can alert you to nourishment, etc., sustain your life. So when the question is what is the exact nature of benefit, and the exact nature of benefit, and maybe exact is not the right word, but my mind can't do better right now. The nature is some change to a living thing. A benefit is a change to a living thing that enhances its self-sustaining pattern, and a harm is a change to a living thing that retards it. That is benefit and harm. So, um, which may not be relevant at all to ordinary living. Just in terms of living, I just sketched, we think about our concerns, our problems, and our goals, and figure out what we want and figure out what makes us happy and go after it. It was to identify when the objectivists who disagree with me or say, well, it benefits the salmon to die, it benefits the a beehive can be benefited because somehow for that species, a hive could be a living thing. What do you mean by benefit? And I think that if you keep pushing, they won't have anything to say. It has to come back to life. But then what is life? It's a chunk of matter that is self-sustaining. And what benefits that is what benefits the self-sustaining process. And what harms that is what retards a self-sustaining process. Now, okay, you got me into a different side. I realized something else. So you come close to it if you say, well, your heart is hurt, your liver is malfunctioning, your pancreas is, there's something wrong with your kidney, something with your eyeballs, your ears are damaged, your arm is damaged. But that's true. But really, exactly, it's the chunk of matter as a chunk of matter. Because if you're talking about heart and lungs and stuff, you're referencing something outside the chunk of matter. Lungs inherently refers to air. So if you're talking about inability to get air as efficiently, that references the external environment, which is outside the living thing. So if we're understanding current benefit, actual benefit, not future benefit, because air is beneficial in the future, air leads to benefit. So lungs, considered from the perspective of giving you air or oxygen or whatever lungs do, that from the perspective of lungs, they're giving you future benefit. But I'm trying to ask the question, what is current actually happening benefit, not future benefit, even if the future benefit happens within 1 millisecond? What's current benefit? And that just has to be the living thing itself, sustaining itself.
hmm.
Describing parts of the living thing being damaged or repaired come close, but to the extent they still refer to future benefit, even by 1 millisecond, or to the extent they refer to things outside the living thing, like the air outside the living thing, or the soil that has nutrients that the plant's roots need to get, you're still referencing something outside the chunk of normativity, the chunk of benefit of self-sustaining action.
Hmm.
Okay.
It seems like there's some kind of static perspective, uh,
No, it's motion,
which
like self-sustaining motion. Sorry, I interrupted. Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
so I'm thinking of, well, if we're going by Ayn Rand's description of life as a process, that's like an inherently non-static sort of thing. It's a something that endures through time.
Which I agree with, which my views agree with.
Okay. I'm just wondering about like can you really say um can you ignore even things you said like even a millisecond later it doesn't matter like
Oh,
if
sorry.
how can you evaluate something in a static kind of way? And maybe you can. I'm not saying you can't. It's just an interesting idea that
Oh, yeah, I think I get it.
I'm
I think I get it. I think I get it. Okay, so I understand. So because a process occurs over time, so the nature of benefit, I think, would be extended over time. For at the moment, yes. And there's still a question of if you're eating lunch and the food gets and then the stomach does whatever it does, when exactly are you benefited? There's still a question there. It's not, even if benefit it's a process that occurs across time, it's still not that when the sandwich is here, it hasn't touched your mouth, but or it's touched your lips, but you haven't digested anything. There's a real question of when benefit happens, even if it's extended across time. And that's what I'm trying to get attention on to really understand the nature of normativity and to challenge the assumption that the species is normative, which is an assumption that which is a view that even that objectivist intellectuals have, which I really want them to question.
maybe the benefit happens when the sandwich hits your taste buds and you have that qualia
No,
of pleasure.
but part of the whole context here is that
Uh,
is that benefit is that normativity and benefit apply not only to those things that feel pleasure and pain, but to living things as such, because they're living things, and pleasure would be an aspect of a living thing, just like wings or gills that enable the living thing to survive. So the pleasure from common sense and from objectivist theory, it motivates people to live. So that gets into normal living, and yeah, go for pleasure, go away from pain, et cetera, et cetera. I was just focusing on when does benefit to a living thing actually happen? And that question is close, the same maybe, or something to what is a living thing. So we're just getting to that self-sustaining chunk of matter. I know, yeah, chunk of matter. I think for some reason I'm emotionally wedded to it, but
mhm,
it really just isolates visually what I'm trying to get focus on.
mhm. I'm thinking of plants now because they don't have pleasure and pain, but I think it seems right to say that certain things benefit or harm a plant, right? If it doesn't get water, that's a harm to it. If it does, it's at least in a limited amount, it's a benefit. So I think these terms apply more broadly than just pleasure than to organisms that have consciousness. There is a question though of, are these is it a literal benefit or is it just kind of in an extended sense? Same with values. I somewhere in the objectivist literature, there's this discussion of do plants have values, like in a literal sense, values for weeds. I think that's the term that came up in it might be in one of these Ayn Rand studies philosophical um, Ayn Rand Society philosophical studies series. Um, I'm not sure if it's in one of those books, but I think there's some discussion of whether plants have values in the robust way that humans do, or is it just kind of an extended sense of value? Um,
Yeah,
a plant you might you might more plausibly say a plant is a chunk of matter because there's no consciousness. We often think of matter as opposed to consciousness, right? There's matter and there's consciousness, a kind of dualistic perspective. But plants, if there is no consciousness, you could really call those chunks of matter in a literal kind of sense if you're taking matter to mean non-conscious. But I don't think you are. So when you're talking about these, the raisins, so when you talk about
Can I
raisins in a
quickly, can I interrupt? Can I?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so as far as the question of do plants have values, and then what's the operating definition of value here, and what justifies that definition of value? For the purpose of understanding part one of my dissertation and normativity in living things, I think that's just neither here nor there. That's why I would want to put the focus on benefit and harm. Can a plant be benefited or harmed? Yes, because it's a living thing. A living thing can be benefited and harmed. Why? Not because it's a kind of living thing, but
Hmm.
because it's a living thing. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I might want to come back to that, but
Yeah.
just one other point first. So when you talk about raisins in a pudding, the raisins are the individual organisms,
Yes.
and the pudding is everything else.
Yes.
So the okay, so
Now, I would even say
the raisins are the fundamental units of value.
they're the social normativity. Yes,
Okay.
technically, but I even got into things like, does the bile in the liver count as part of you, the chunk of matter that is a living thing? So just I'm a living thing, so I have a certain volume. I forgot what volume is. Anyway, um, okay, do I know what volume? Whatever.
Height,
So
length, and
not
width.
everything. I mean, does my saliva and my blood count as part of my living thing? I mean, obviously, oh man, this is getting so in a common sense, many contexts, objective way, yes, my blood is part of my living thing, my saliva, but my tears, my whatever. But if we're talking about just really trying to isolate, see, I'm really trying to isolate the living thing itself. So enzymes and bile and blood, it seem like separate. I mean, things that are benefiting the living thing because they will benefit the living thing. But what is the really just that individual living thing? So I don't know if I'm getting, but putting with raisins, yes. So thank you for that. And then within the raisins, may have pockets in them that are not part of the living thing, but like, okay, pacemaker,
Hmm.
right,
Uh,
right,
uh,
right.
so maybe there are
But
pockets within the raisins
yeah,
that could be extracted.
and that could be just so hair splitting and irrelevant. But I just wanted to take the opportunity just to really emphasize how seriously I'm trying to think about the exact nature of life and normativity and the living thing and the individual.
Okay.
Okay, okay.
So maybe let's go try to get some more into this idea of species norms versus individual norms. So you said like if a rabbit could sprout wings and that could help it survive, that would be good for the rabbits. Um,
There's a
and I
faster,
go ahead.
there may be a faster way or better way or easier way here. Instead of getting into like, what if you have a rabbit with wings and all that stuff? Um, I need sleep. Why do I need sleep? Okay, if you say, well, you're a human being, Bach, and human beings need sleep, that's why you need sleep. I'm thinking, I don't know about that. I mean, that's true. Deduct, but I need sleep just given my biology, I need sleep. So, yes, it's true. There are other living, and I would need sleep even if I were the only living thing in the universe. Now, yes, there are other living things. You're a living thing. The people watching this video or listening are living things. They also are human beings. They also need sleep. But those facts are just totally irrelevant to the fact that I need sleep. And what makes it true that I need sleep? What makes it true is just facts about my biology. not the fact that there are other living things and I belong to a certain class of human being. You may bring in those concepts to explain the need, but the need of sleep is just a fact about my individual living thing.
Hmm.
Counterexamples like rabbits with wings, what if I had wings? It can be a heuristic. I don't know if I'm using that term correctly here, but it can be a way of getting to the point I made. But I don't need those. Just it's just a way of it's just pedagogy. But here, it's just my point is, even if you identify something about me that is common to all human beings and essential, and it's an individual fact.
Yeah, and if we could engineer you, genetically engineer you, or give you some medicine that made it not the case that you need sleep, then why not give it to you? You know,
And
if
yes, and whether I'm still to be called a human being or not is just a separate. You can have that in a separate discussion, but normativity is grounded in the reason.
yeah, this is making me think of GMOs and all the advancements in medical technology. We're playing God in a way, as it's sometimes put. You know, we're changing human beings to make them better. Designer babies, I think that's a thing, or might become a
I
thing. Um,
so I came to these ideas starting in around 2006, and initially I thought it was fleet of foot natural goodness, and then she said, "Well, rabbits have four legs. You know, if you have a three-legged rabbit, that's defective." And I thought, what if you have a five-legged rabbit? Wouldn't that be a benefit if it could be faster? Now, at the time, I thought the thought I have is very small and kind of stupid, or it's small, it's a tiny little point, not that important. So I'll just make this point in a paper. But then it got some resistance, and then I kept developing this theory. And I thought I still sometimes think this what I have to say is not that important. It's not important at all in some sense. But then I got resistance from objectivists, and then you get the beehive being alive. Then you get the salmon benefiting if it dies. I thought, no, wait a minute. If your views are coming to this, then my idea is not just some small footnote that's irrelevant. There's something here that needs to be really thought out. Okay.
mhm.
Yeah, may I add one more thing?
Yeah, go.
May I add one more thing here? In some of those discussions, when the objectivists I was interacting with, when they were examining literature in academic philosophy within the neo-Aristotelian tradition and coming upon the view that what's normative is the life form, they were very interested in that. And I got and a major source of this view, Michael Thompson, he's a philosopher, I believe, is at Pittsburgh. Um, he argues for these life forms being normative, these species concepts being normative, and part of his views are that these are a priori, not derived from experience. Now, the objectivists I was talking to seem to regard this as just it's a quirk, we can ignore it, but what's really good about Thompson is the life form concept. I got very suspicious because you're saying you don't actually care about the argument in defense of this. You're just trying to use it as a launching point for Ayn Rand. Well, actually, hold on. I'm not trying to get personal, unnecessarily critical. I think I commend finding any place in academic philosophy where you can get an in for Ayn Rand. So green light, two thumbs up. I love you. Keep fighting for objectivism. Thank you, objectivist intellectuals, for fighting for objectivism. At the same time, if you're just going to blindly, breezily dismiss the claim that these life forms are a priori and then keep running with it and then keep running with it seriously and apply it and say that species norms are applicable are normative for living things and get to the conclusion that salmon that die are benefiting themselves, something's gone very wrong, very wrong. um I don't know, the point I made just may be so obscure and just relevant to like 8 people on the planet, but there you go.
That's okay. Well, maybe some of them will
Yeah,
want to have a discussion with you about it.
yeah,
You can get into more detail with them.
yeah.
Um, okay. Is there anything else about part one of the dissertation that you think we should, or that you're interested in talking about now? Or should we talk some about
No.
your other projects?
Yeah, just to sum up, part one, Raisin. Part two, emotional defense of egoism. End.
Emotional defensive egoism. That's
Yes.
interesting. Um, Hopefully at least consistent with a
Yeah, it is.
cognitive rational defense.
Oh, it is because I lay out in the beginning that benefit is benefit to life, and then the rest is talking about reflective equilibrium in regard to benefit. And this is we're done. We're done. We're good.
Okay, so that's the dissertation. If people want to know more about it, you can actually find it online. I discovered that. I just Googled a defense of egoism, Bach Ho, and I was able to find your dissertation pretty quickly. So if people want to dig into it some more, you can find it and then do what you will with it.
Yeah.
And but Bach has recently been producing videos for a YouTube channel of his own that relate to something called organic intelligence, which I had not heard of until recently. So Bach, why don't you tell us some about what that is?
Yeah, can I challenge? I I would thank you for the opportunity. I'm of too much. I'm probably thinking what we just covered was a good chunk. So should we continue? I would like to. I mean, it'd be nice to continue, but just that was kind of an intense like thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this could
Should we just
be,
continue and just keep
it could
going?
be in two parts. We
Yeah.
could either have the second discussion right now, or we could do it on a different day. Um, I guess I'm fine with just talking about it some now, but if you prefer to do it at a different day, that's fine too.
Let's do a different day because I'm a kind of tired from that intensity. That was a bit like to switch context from the dissertation to organic intelligence in the moment. Let's yeah, let me call it there because my brain is
Okay.
just it's not easy for that was because that I really liked that by the way, what just happened.
The you mean the whole discussion
Yeah,
of,
yeah, yeah.
okay, yeah, I mean that's kind of a self-contained chunk
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a raisin. And
It's
so
a
maybe we
raisin.
should,
It's a raisin. It's a raisin.
the organic intelligence discussion can be another raisin
Let's do
that we
that.
just
Okay.
discuss on another day.
Let's do
Okay,
that. Let's do that.
then let's draw a line here. Thanks, Bach, for coming on. I appreciate the discussion, and we will talk again sometime.
Okay, sounds good.
All right,
Thank you,
bye
everyone.
bye.